Indonesia's President Habibie has bowed to international pressure and agreed to let peacekeeping troops into East Timor. Australian forces are on standby to go into the shattered territory. Britain will also provide troops. Welcome to BBC News. I'm Janet Barry. The other headlines. The German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder suffered another blow by losing one of his party's strongholds in regional elections. And 10 years on, Poland remembers an event that changed the face of Europe. We start with reports coming in of an explosion in Moscow which has destroyed an 8-story building. The Russian news agency Interfax says the blast happened in the southeast of the city. More than 30 ambulances, fire engines and a search team have gone to the scene. Early reports say there have been fatalities, but the number is unclear. It's the second massive blast in the city in less than a week, and for the latest I'm joined from Moscow by our correspondent Andrew Harding. Andrew, any word yet on casualties?
Yes, Russian television reporting 11 now dead. That's not been confirmed by the police, but certainly it looks as though there were fatalities. And
how is the rescue operation progressing at the moment? What's the scene there now?
There are dozens of rescue vehicles at the scene already, but we don't know the precise condition of the block of flats. One Moscow radio station is reporting that the building was completely destroyed, much like last week's apartment block, which was also totally devastated by an explosion.
Any idea how many people might have been inside when it happened?
According to one report, there were 46 separate apartments in this block. If they were all destroyed, we are looking, assuming there were 2 at least people in each flat, well over 100.
Now, the Russian news agency Interfax is describing this as a terrorist act. Is there any evidence to support that?
None yet, no concrete evidence, but certainly that is the suspicion that almost all Muscovites, I think, will be reaching this morning, given the fact that it's just a few days since another explosion tore through another residential apartment block in this part of town. And today is actually a day of national mourning for that explosion, which killed some 90 people, for an earlier explosion in southern Russia, which killed about 60, and for a bomb which went off in a shopping arcade close to the Kremlin, which killed 1 and injured dozens. The feeling here certainly is that some sort of terrorist campaign is beginning, although the authorities are still urging caution and saying that they haven't actually found concrete evidence linking any particular group to these attacks.
Andrew Harding, our correspondent in Moscow, thanks for joining us. The Indonesian President B.J. Habibie has said he will allow a UN peacekeeping force into East Timor. He gave the announcement during a nationwide television address. The President said he came to the decision after speaking to members of his cabinet and the team of ambassadors from the UN Security Council who've just returned from Dili. Australia says that the troops it has on standby could be ready for deployment in 2 days. Excuse me, Britain has promised to send 250 Gurkhas, and the destroyer HMS Glasgow is also being sent to the region. It's feared 300,000 people have been forced out of their homes by the pro-Indonesian militias. 1,000 are still sheltering in the UN compound in Dili. Others have been forced to hide in the mountains or leave the island altogether.
In Auckland for the Asia-Pacific Economic Summit, world leaders expressed relief that Indonesia had finally buckled under the pressure. The task now is to organise an effective peacekeeping force to halt the bloodshed. President Clinton said that America would contribute planes, pilots and logistical support.
In terms of what our role would be in East Timor, we have had extensive discussions with the Australians through our defence channels. And we've been asked to provide a limited but important function related to airlift, transportation, communications, intelligence, and perhaps some engineering work. Exactly what the details would be have yet to be worked out and require more extensive consultations with Congress.
These Australian troops on standby in Darwin will be amongst the first to reach East Timor, but there are still questions to be answered over the makeup of this peacekeeping force, its mandate, and perhaps most importantly, what happens if things go wrong.
Too many people have lost their lives.
Indonesia's President B.J. Habibie may have welcomed in the peacekeepers, but his troops may not. The fear is that the UN will have to deal with troops and militia members responsible for mass murder. But there will now be at least some protection for East Timor civilians. There have been reports of rejoicing from the thousands sheltering in the besieged UN compound. East Timor's spiritual leader, the Nobel Prize winner Carlos Bello, himself forced to flee the territory when the militias attacked his home, called on the international community to move quickly.
I hope that into 24 hours or at least 48 hours, this international peacekeeping force should land in East Timor to defend those people still on the mountains, in the camp of refugees, and to protect the civilian population against the abuse of Indonesian army and their militias.
UN troops may be on the ground in East Timor within days, replacing these Indonesian forces who have failed so spectacularly in ensuring law and order. Relief for the East Timorese, but humiliating defeat for the pro-Jakarta militias, and no one expects this mission to be easy. Tony Smith, BBC News.
Events in East Timor have overshadowed the APEC summit in Auckland in New Zealand. Asia-Pacific leaders have pledged their full support for an international peacekeeping force to be sent to the territory.
This East Timorese student is a desperate man. He's watching helplessly in Auckland as his homeland goes up in flames. He doesn't know if his family and friends have survived the bloodshed. All he can do is wait and pray for a miracle.
After the ballot was announced, the paramilitary took all men away, and the women were forced to board the ship and taken to West Timor. So far, I don't know exactly, and they also don't know exactly where my brothers are.
He isn't the only one begging world leaders to end the killing. Public pressure here has mounted. The protesters don't trust Jakarta's promises. They want international peacekeepers in place as soon as possible. Indonesians feel increasingly under diplomatic siege.
We feel that we have been treated rather unfairly. People have never asked our side of the story. And even if we try to explain it, they just outright dismiss it.
Images of suffering and devastation in East Timor have haunted these talks. Some countries wanted to keep quiet on politics and focus on trade, but for others the sheer scale of the horror made it impossible to stay silent and be seen to do nothing.
This has to be resolved through diplomatic means. We have very successfully now built an enormous international coalition in support of quite clear objectives.
At first, APEC seemed dazed by the crisis, hesitant and confused in its response. Australia took the lead in calling for action, backed by hosts New Zealand. But even their strategy was to woo Jakarta, not bully it. It took the arrival of President Clinton to break the deadlock. He brought a far tougher approach, severing military ties and threatening economic cuts. Suddenly Jakarta was forced to respond, and APEC looked more than just a showcase. It was a forum for real political business. This summit was supposed to get APEC back on track after 2 years of economic turmoil. But public protests like this have put politics on the agenda at the expense of trade and increased, not healed, political divisions. Jill McGivering, BBC News, Auckland.
Well, earlier I was joined by our correspondent in Jakarta, Jonathan Head, and by John Taylor, an expert on Southeast Asian studies from the South Bank University here in London. I asked Jonathan Head first how the news of President Habibie's announcement had been received in Indonesia itself.
Well, I think it'll be in East Timor we're going to have some problems finding out, simply because it's very hard for news to come out of the territory. But in Indonesia, although it's very early morning here, the papers are reporting it quite neutrally. There's not the sense of shock or shame that perhaps one might have expected. I think for most Indonesians, the whole fiasco over East Timor has been a great humiliation, and most of them will be glad to see the issue of East Timor resolved, whatever it takes. I think the argument that East Timor is different, they've been prepared for the idea possibly of losing it, will lead to them accepting the idea of foreign troops coming into what Indonesians regard as their own soil for the first time since independence as something they can probably learn to live with.
John Taylor here in the studio with me. What was it, do you think, that pushed Jakarta into accepting this offer of peacekeepers?
I think it was primarily international pressure, really. I think that
the Army's project in East Timor has been slightly derailed recently. But I think that although it's sort of being reported as something which is good, and it is in a sense, I think it actually is quite a new and in a way quite a dangerous phase really, because Habibie himself is still in a fairly weak position, and after all Indonesian troops are in control now in East Timor, and they're going to be there for about 2-3 weeks, maybe even before an international peacekeeping force comes in. They've already displaced about 200,000 people, so they can clearly organise East Timor in such a way to benefit their strategy in the coming weeks. And I think it's going to be really difficult to sort this situation out, despite the kind of euphoria about Habibie's decision.
Jonathan Head in Jakarta, President Habibie has said he wants to see these peacekeepers work with Indonesian troops on the ground. In your experience, from what you've seen in East Timor, how do you think that would work?
Well, frankly, it wouldn't. I think that's just a concession to national pride. In essence, the UN force that comes in is going to have to work on its own and have to work with Indonesian troops who are still there, who are clearly very resentful of their presence and are very determined to stop East Timor from breaking away. It's going to be very, very difficult. That'll be something that Foreign Minister Ali Alatas will be talking about with Kofi Annan over the next 48 hours. But I suspect a lot of those problems will have to be resolved on the ground once the first troops arrive.
John Taylor here, it may take weeks to deploy this force. What happens in the meantime in this hiatus?
Well, I think if you're asking what happens in East Timor, then I think clearly the army will try and consolidate their position. They'll move against areas where there are groups supporting independence. They'll try and forcibly displace the population to Indonesian Timor and other parts of Indonesia to replace it with a population who are in favour of integration. So although almost 80% of the population voted in favour of independence, the army will try and rig it so that either they can have, they'll still try to have a sort of client state in East Timor, but which is actually effectively ruled by pro-integration people. That's what they're going to try and aim to do, and the international community has got to stop them from doing that.
How can they go about stopping them from doing that?
Well, they can deploy troops as soon as possible. I mean, if the Indonesians have been able to, if Indonesian troops have been able to displace so many people in such a short space of time, it follows logically that if troops can be introduced in 3, 4, 5 days, then they can stop this. If they're going to wait 2 or 3 weeks, that long to get it together, then the situation will go on, more people will be killed, and the Indonesian army will try and realise its project of totally transforming East Timor against the wishes of its people. So it really depends on how quickly the force can go in, and it depends how strong governments in the international community are.
Jonathan Head in Jakarta, is the composition of this force a factor? Do you think one composition of it would be more effective than another, more acceptable even than another?
Well, to be realistic, the composition will be largely Australian with backup from a lot of other countries. The Indonesians want an Asian peacekeeping force, but that would very much depend on how ready its ASEAN neighbours were to put significant numbers of troops in. And at this stage that isn't clear. I doubt there will be more than a fairly small token presence of ASEAN neighbours. It'll be largely Australian-led with a very large amount of American logistical backup, and the Indonesians will have to live with that. No other force is going to be practical in the short term.
That was our correspondent in Jakarta, Jonathan Head, and I was also joined by John Taylor from the South Bank University here in London. Well, voters in Germany have once again signalled their dissatisfaction with the performance of Chancellor Gerhard Schröder's Red-Green coalition government. The Social Democrats have endured further heavy losses in the regional elections in the state of Thüringen, where they were thrown out of the coalition government, and in city elections in the industrial region of North Rhine-Westphalia. Cologne and Dortmund have swung to the Christian Democrats.
It was beers all round for the Christian Democrats in the eastern state of Thüringen as their party took full control of the region after governing in coalition with the Social Democrats for the last 5 years. The popular CDU Prime Minister Bernhard Vogel has attempted to emulate the economic success of western states such as Bavaria, and it's a strategy which is paying off.
What makes me especially happy is the extreme right's absence from the state government.
Polls suggest many people in the state voted on national rather than local issues, making it another indicator of the declining popularity of the Schröder government. The result will worsen the German leader's chances of getting his 30 billion Deutschmark austerity budget through the Bundesrat without amendments. Schröder's Social Democratic Party was the CDU's partner in Thuringen's coalition, but in a humiliating defeat was forced into third place behind the former communist PDS. As he left, the party's leader, Richard Davis, was heckled by people who said he'd betrayed the working class. The Thuringen result follows poll defeats in the Saarland and Brandenburg states last week. It confirms a dramatic loss of confidence in Schröder's Red-Green coalition government. Alice Coulter, BBC News.